I've mentioned this before, and when talking about other texts already, but just to review, for the ancient mind, sex was simply one cog in a wheel. Because why did you have sex? In order to make babies. Why did you need to make babies? Because so many of them were dying all the time. I think I've told you the statistic that in the ancient world, for the population of the Roman Empire just to remain stable, not for it to grow, just for it to remain stable, every woman who lived to childbearing age, which was considered about 14 in the ancient world, had to have an average of 5 childbirths for the population to remain stable. Think of this, girls. Every one of you would have to have at least 5 childbirths on average just to maintain the population. That just shows how many people died in childbirth, how many women died giving childbirth, how many infants died. So in people's minds, every birth was automatically linked in their mind to death because it was a dangerous thing. People died often in childbirth, and women died giving birth, and so many children died. And they also knew that they had to keep having babies or the population would shrink. And populations in the ancient world did often shrink. And that was dangerous because whole cities could disappear. Whole populations could disappear if the birth rate didn't remain high. So every birth was considered because you had to have babies. Why did you need babies? Because people were always dying. So the idea was you have sex, birth, death, decay. Sex, birth, death, decay. Sex, birth, death, decay. That's all what life is. Life is a big circle of sex, birth, death, and decay. And now comes Christianity, which says we're going to teach you to break that cycle. How do you break the cycle? Well, it may not be intuitive to you, but this seemed to be intuitive to a lot of ancient people who incorporated this into their teachings about Christianity. The Christians said, stop it at sex. Break the cycle at sex. And that's why in these texts, it's not intuitive to us, but it's intuitive to them that if you want to stop that cycle of sex, birth, death, and decay, the easiest place for human beings to stop it is at sex. Just break the cycle. Don't have sex, don't have childbirth, don't have death. And of course, they believed they had an answer for the death part because they believed with Christianity, with Jesus Christ, you would have resurrection. The body would be raised. So you don't need childbirth anymore. If you're a faithful Christian, you'll live forever anyway. So you don't need to replenish the population by having more babies. All the people who are Christians who come into Christ will be resurrected and will live forever. So there's no need for more and more population. So the reason that these texts, and this is not the only one, this is just one place where it's very clear, because whenever Paul talks about sex, he also talks about death. He talks about corruption, and he talks about resurrection. So this text very clearly pulls all of these issues in to one another. So the basic sensibility of this gospel that we moderns don't have, and you have to imagine yourself back into their world, is the radical availability of death and the linkage of death with sex in ancient minds. And then also the linkage of all these other things with sexuality and death and corruption. Christianity said, stop the cycle at sex and you get rid of death. Radical as that may sound to us. The problem, of course, is in this text, the people who find that message very compelling are young women, a lot of wives, although not all of them, and even young men. Also, people who find that message compelling happen to be lionesses. The female animals also like this message, right? Who are the ones who gang up on the bad male animals who are trying to attack Thecla in the arena? The female lion. So the text is set up as an opposition. But now notice, I said young men are also included in the good side of this sometimes. So what is the opposition to Paul's gospel? It's not men versus women, right? What is the opposition? It's male heads of households against everybody else who would be members of their household. The people who oppose Paul the most in this text are male heads of households, precisely because they recognize that challenging the centrality of sex and childbirth will in itself challenge their household. In their system, you have to have sex and childbirth in order to maintain the household structure. So they're the ones who are against Paul. Notice in this, Paul himself is rather ambiguously placed. He's a man. So what is Paul's role in all of this? I think it's interesting that Paul doesn't come across in this text, at least in my reading, as being a totally positive character. It praises him, of course, and presents him as a man of God. But notice some of the things that Paul does. Paul refuses to baptize her. Remember, she has to baptize herself. This is that wonderful scene, right, where she's being martyred. They're trying to martyr her again, and they strip her naked, and then they have this big vat of killer man-eating seals. Yes, that's what it says. You probably didn't even know there were man-eating seals, but there were in the ancient Mediterranean world. So and instead of waiting to be thrown into the vat of man-eating seals, a lightning bolt comes down from the sky, strikes the bottom, all the man-eating seals die, so God saves her. And then, though, not to let the scene finish, she's already, there's water, she's asked Paul to baptize her once, and he wouldn't do it. So she throws herself into the water and baptizes herself. This is a woman. You're not supposed to let women go around baptizing themselves. That could just disrupt all kinds of stuff. So Paul, at one point, says he doesn't even know her in one place. He refuses to baptize her. And Paul gets in trouble. He runs off and hides in caves and stuff. Who's the big hero of this story? It's not Paul. He's, one of the heroes, but it's really Thecla. It's this woman who totally refuses to accept her role as a baby factory. And that's what women are in the ancient world, baby factories. She totally refuses to accept that role. She baptizes herself when Paul hesitates to baptize her. And then, of course, at the very end of the document, remember how it ends? She goes to Paul and she says she wants to be a follower of his. And he kind of just says, no, go, don't leave me alone. Paul is not all that great with her. What does she do? First, she inherits a bunch of money. Another rich woman left her a ton of money. So she's able to support herself and her mother. I guess she and her mother, by the end of the thing, are now in good terms. I mean, if you survive lightning and man-eating seals and God saves you, maybe your mother will like you better and let you not get married. But so she supports herself financially through an inheritance that she gets from another woman. And then what does she do? She cuts her hair short. She dresses like a man. She actually becomes an apostle. She goes off to spread the message of this ascetic, sex-avoiding, anti-family, anti-household gospel that she got from Paul. Thecla becomes her own apostle, spreading the message. And notice what kind of gospel she's going around teaching. This is not pro-family. This is not patriotic. This is not nationalism. This is putting all your eggs in the basket of the kingdom of God. That's the only thing worth living for, is the kingdom of God. And how do you get into the kingdom of God? By avoiding sex and avoiding the household. That's how you get in and enjoy it and remain. How do you avoid death? By being resurrected. So this message is a very erotic message in a sense. It's not getting sexual eroticism or sexual desire and throwing it all out the window. It's actually using eroticism and the appeal to beauty and the appeal of sexual desire, and it's capitalizing on it. The author is trying to get you, as a young person who's afraid about death, to convert to a message of the gospel that will liberate you from the cycle of corruption and death that you will get into if you agree to go along with sex, birth, death, decay. And that's what you do if you choose the household. So it's a radical document. Now the question is this a feminist document? It's a good question. It raises Thecla up even above Paul. And it gives a message of liberation to women, at least from whatever it is that keeps them down at the time, which is the patriarchal household. It gives them a way out of that. This is one of the reasons that there were a lot of women in the ancient world who became nuns, who wanted to avoid the household. And you had women running away from their wives all the time. Church leaders talk about it. Why? Because you had to get out of the household if you wanted to have any kind of independence or liberty. If you wanted to have any kind of exercise of power, you had to get out of the male-dominated household. So Christianity, a whole strain of Christianity, appealed to precisely those kinds of people. And the author is trying to get you, as a young person, to make that choice also. Now, the big question is, do you think it's feminist? Is this feminism? Or is there something wrong with thinking about it as feminism? If you're writing a paper this week, maybe you can talk about that. Another big question is, do you think this author is actually attacking the pastoral epistles? Are the pastoral epistles attacking this author? They're presenting two diametrically opposed versions of Paul. They both claim Paul as their author. They both claim to be representing Paul's gospel, Paul's message. But one of them is very pro-household and marriage and sex and childbirth, and the other is anti-marriage, anti-household, anti-childbirth, and anti-sex. They both claim Paul as the author of their gospel. Do they know each other? That's the interesting historical question. Or is it just by accident that we have these two very radically different appropriations of Paul? All of those questions I hope you'll talk about in your discussion groups later this week, and if you're writing papers, push yourself to answer some big questions in your papers.